Welcome back. I'm Ryan from Blued Gaming, and today I'm giving my thoughts on the Hourus Heresy Betrayal at Calth. Now, before we get into this, I do have 3 disclaimers to get through, so let's get right into those. The first one, I was given a key to look at this game for you guys, so take that into account when I say anything. But moving on to disclaimer 2, this is not a review for the game. This game just came into early access as of the day of uploading this, and I think that it is way too early in the development cycle of this game to actually give a review. I'm just going to be giving my thoughts on it, and from there you guys can make your own judgment on whether or not you want to buy into it this early or not. And on to the third disclaimer. When talking about this game, I will be using some words that are specific to Warhammer 40k and its surrounding universe, so I'm not going to be explaining things or everything that I say. So if you don't know much about Warhammer 40k, first off, this isn't the video for you. This probably won't be the game for you. But then again, I think that trying to enter into the Warhammer 40k universe through a game is a pretty bad idea. It usually involves a lot of reading and watching a bunch of lore videos to get into Warhammer 40k. So now that we got that out of the way, let's just get into what I think about the Hourus Heresy Betrayal at Calth. So starting off, this game is actually based off of a board game of the same name, and from looking at previous Warhammer games, that seems to set the game up to be a little bit better than some of these other games that have to come up with things from scratch, because they actually have a basis to work with and something to build off of. And so far, it seems to be really good for how they're actually taking this board game and turning it into an actual video game. And now let's move into the different modes and just the different things that this game has to offer. Starting out, there's a single player which currently has 1 act, which is 6 missions. The first couple are just basic tutorial missions. The first mission is entirely just kind of like a static cutscene. You do actually get to move around in it though, but it sets up the character and then you play through a bit of it. It's just the beginning of the story. By the time this game finishes, they're looking at 5 acts in total, which from how much of the story they actually covered in the first act, it might be slightly concerning how they're going to be able to get through the entire story of the Betrayal at Calth in 5 acts, but if they end up being longer missions than what they were currently, then they can definitely pull that off, because right now most of the missions can be completed in less than 10 minutes. The longest mission for me personally was the 5th mission, which took almost 30 minutes, but overall this complete Act 1 can be finished anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. And I'll go into a bit more of the story here in just a little bit, but I'm going to get through the other modes first. Next, there is multiplayer, which this game does have an element of actually army building, which I don't think I've actually seen in any other 40k game. But it is a big thing in actual playing tabletop 40k. Before you actually start, you have to build an army with a set amount of points and whatnot, and there's different rules on how many points you can have and whatnot. And this is the first game that I can really think of set in the 40k universe that actually takes a bit of that army building and actually puts it into some use, so that's pretty cool. But with multiplayer, I didn't get to play any of it because I am playing a pre-release version of a early access game, so there wasn't anybody else that I could really play with. And so I'm expecting it to be 2 people build their armies to a set amount of points and then they fight each other. So that's going to be pretty interesting, and depending on how long the campaign actually ends up being, that multiplayer mode may actually be the longevity of this game. Next is the Lexicanum, which is essentially an encyclopedia, but in this game, I don't think that they've really worked on that yet, because once you click the Lexicanum, it just spawns you into a room with a bunch of Ultramarines to look around. So I think that they will be adding more to that. I at least hope so. And then finally, the options. As of right now, they are very barebone, but they have said that that is not the final options menu. They're adding a lot more options. They definitely need to, with this being a VR game, which I'll get into here in a bit, but the options menu still is very bare bones at the moment. So now that we have that out of the way, the three things that I'll cover before I end off the video is going to be the story, then I'll get into the gameplay, and then the VR parts of it, and then I'll end off the video. So, starting out with the story, as you can tell from the title, this does have to deal with the Betrayal at Calth, which, if you want to read more about it, you're going to want to either look up the Battle of Calth or the Calth Atrocity, as it's known by those names, more usually than the Betrayal at Calth. But essentially, to kind of quickly go through this is back during the early stages of the Horus Heresy, back before the Battle of Terra. Essentially, Horus wanted the 13th Space Marine Legion, also known as the Ultramarines, to not participate in the Battle of Terra. They didn't want them to be able to supply reinforcements for that battle. So, what they did is they sent the 17th Space Marine Legion, also known as the Word Bearers, to siege Calth and to stop the Ultramarines from participating in the Battle of Terra, which was done successfully when the Word Bearers went and just completely almost destroyed Calth in a siege. But the Ultramarines, because they are still around, you can pretty obviously tell that they did end up defeating the Word Bearers, although it cost some pretty big casualties and pretty much almost the entire destruction of Calth, as its entire atmosphere was destroyed, and the people of Calth, after the Battle of Calth, had to live underground in cities because the atmosphere of the world was just destroyed. Now, that was just a quick rundown of it. I highly recommend that you go read more on the Battle of Calth. I think that this is one of the better stories that the Ultramarines are in, as I'm not particularly a big fan of the Ultramarines themselves, but this is one of the few stories that I actually like about the Ultramarines. It's really interesting to me. If you're not big into the Horus Heresy, then you don't really have to read much into the Battle of Calth to understand this game, but if you do want to read more into the backstory, there's a bunch of backstory on the Battle of Calth. Now, something that I almost forgot to mention is that actually in the beginning of the game, you don't play as any sort of Ultramarine or anything like that. You actually start out as a tech priest, although his involvement in the story kind of goes slightly down as you go through the act, and by the end of the act, he's not even in Act 6, so I don't know if the tech priest that you play in the beginning of the game will specifically come up in later acts. It doesn't feel like you will, but that's kind of interesting, because I can't think of another 40k game where you actually play as a tech priest. So that's kind of cool. But let's get into the actual gameplay and what you're going to be doing when you play this game. So when I first started playing this game, I thought that this would actually be somewhat confusing, because they show you everything at once, but they do actually go through and tell you how to use each thing, and so after a while it actually becomes really easy. So essentially there's several things that you have to worry about. The first one is the actual place that you are on, kind of the board. There is just regular terrain pieces. There's different pieces of cover. You can either have partial half cover, you can have full half cover, and then you can have full cover. Partial half cover you can actually move through, and it decreases the percentage or the chance that the enemy is going to hit you. Then the full half cover decreases the chance that the enemy is going to hit you, but you cannot move through it. And then full cover completely blocks the enemy from being able to see you or hit you, but you also cannot see them or hit them. There's also rough terrain that you can run into, which will restrict your movement, but will also make it harder for the enemies to hit you. So that's really the kind of different terrain pieces that you run into. Each unit is made up of 3 specific Marines, usually, but there was the Tech Priest and stuff. Each of these have a different amount of health. Most of the Space Marines have 5, or it's actually armor, so you can lose all 5 of your armor and then still be alive, but once you get hit again, you will die. Typically, they will lose multiple chunks of armor at once, like 2 or 3 of their 5 total armor at one time. They can also just instantly die without losing all of their armor. And then pretty much the abilities that you get to do is you can move 2 spaces every one time. Then you can also you can attack with just regular shooting at people. You can also attack by going into melee. You can do just standard movement. Then there's a thing called Reform, I believe it is, where you can take your units, like the group as a whole, and you can actually individually move units from those groups. So that's pretty cool. You can kind of, once several people from a group die, you can kind of move the surviving soldiers together into and reform full groups and stuff. And there's also another thing that you can do where you can kind of skip your turn. And speaking of turns, they are set up kind of weirdly in this. There is rounds, and then there's also turns. Essentially, each unit or each group has 2 kind of like ability points that they can use to either move or pass their turn or fire at someone. Those ability points come back after each round, but to kind of give an example, say I have one group and the enemy has one group, I can move. I can like move to a place, and then it will become my opponent's turn. They can do something, and then it comes back to my turn. I can do something again. I've now used all my points. Then it goes back to the opponent's turn. They move or do whatever, and they've used all of their points, and then it becomes the second or the next round. So it's kind of set up weird like that, but essentially it makes it so that you have to use all of your different groups of soldiers before you can go back and reuse the other ones again. It seems kind of clunky, but I'm pretty sure that this is something that came over from the board game. But overall, it does still feel a bit clunky. Although, all in all, I do really like the way that this game is set up. You can see down at the bottom of the screen that there is a 6th and 7th option of things that you can do, but the game has not yet introduced what those are. I believe that they will introduce what those are in the 2nd act, but because we don't have access to that yet, we can't really figure out what it is. And so now let's actually almost wrap this video up. I will talk about one thing that I can't really talk about for that long. It's the VR support in this game. I can't talk about it for long because I don't actually have a VR headset, so I can't try it out. But you can pretty much see with the way that it's that the whole game works, that it's kind of set up for VR. Just the way that you control the camera, the way that the menus kind of work, everything is really designed for VR. I'm just wondering, with how it is right now, you really have to look, like, where the menu is static on the screen. Or not really static, but it's static in the play zone, but you can like look around and completely move the menu off your screen. It's something that comes over from VR, but it feels a little weird with without VR just being with mouse and keyboard. And so there's a few things like that with how like the menus are placed and how you actually have to like click things, and how you can look around while still having a menu up. It's just a little weird, and you kind of have to get used to it. The only real downside that I've found is that you can press spacebar to have a tactical map come up, and on mouse and keyboard, that tactical map is placed up a bit too high, so you can only really get a good look at like 3/4 of it, because you can't look high enough to actually see what's going on the last or the upper like third or upper fourth of the map. So that's the only real downside that I've found from the VR. So that's pretty much it. I've been rambling on for about 16 and a half minutes so far. Because this game is very early in early access, it did just release today. I do plan on doing more videos on this game as it continues through the development cycle, potentially as it releases new acts, kind of give my thoughts on each of those. The devs has stated that they would be releasing the full game shortly after they released the 5th act in the single player, so I don't know if I'm going to be having an early access review of this game, but I will definitely be having a full release review of this game once it comes out sometime in the future. So that is going to be it for this. Remember, I'm Ryan from Bluewood Gaming, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.